All right, folks, we're at this again. And I'm about a day late. And part of that day late business is just dealing with all this silly coronavirus stuff running around our middle school here. But I've got a much bigger presentation on the Great Depression. And some of it we already know because we're going to go into the causes of it. And then I'm going to get into some of the effects that we haven't seen yet. And with what caused all this. Great Dorothea Lange picture here, which is just heart wrenching when you think about it. You know, you see what children and families are living through, but you look at what historians point to the five causes or five long-term causes of the Great Depression, and it's a combination of them. I mean, you look at it: weak industry. We talked about that in the last lecture. Overproduction of durable goods. You know, polarized income distribution. A rotten banking system. And a tottering international economy. Those things set you up for failure under the. But you look at this weak American industry, and you look at World War I, that recovery, and a shift in manufacturing and farming. The farming part, then you move into much. It's almost like bonanza farming from the late 19th century. So you get these huge commercial agricultural operations, but it drives down the price of some commodities, which puts the regular smaller farmer in a lot of danger. You know, look at cotton production here in our area. You know, we've got synthetic stuff, Dacron polyester, you know, automobiles and low commodity prices. These are things that are weakening the American economy. Looked good for a while, but that wave went up and then it crested, and now we're on the downside of it. We know about the overproduction and how use of credit ties up consumers' revenue and how they've got to pay this stuff back. And so what you get are factories churning out goods, but people that are not able to buy them. And so they're overflowing. All right, so now you've got a problem. You've got stuff sitting there that has to be paid for somehow, some way. Generally, that's by a company selling it, and so now it's just sitting there waiting. So this is a bad situation. Polarized income. Now, this is the same figures that I used on the last lecture about how 5% had about 30% of the total income, and low wages for industrial workers, low wages for farmers, and about how half of the country live below the poverty line. That is not a situation for economic growth. Then you look at that banking system. You know, mismanagement of funds and that specious lending. You know, I talked about how they lent money to people to buy stocks on the margin. They lent money for people to invest. Well, you can't do that anymore. And when 1% of the banks control about half of the nation's banking resources, if one of them goes under, we've got a problem. And that's what's going to happen in the late 20s and early 30s. Then you look at the whole international economy. It's not just in America, it's everywhere else. You look at that Hawley Smoot, and 23 nations retaliate by imposing those high tariffs on us. And so what happens is that trade war has begun. And it's begun even before Hawley Smoot, because as you know, that doesn't happen until 1930, whereas the crash in 1929. And so there it is. You see the Hindenburg over Lakehurst, New Jersey, which is the best metaphor that I have. Wall Street lays an egg moniker that we talked about. You know, in the next slide, you're going to see a graph that's going to show what happens to the stock market. But you go from October into November and look at that 25. That's what we see. That first $25 billion. That's a lot of money today. That was a ton of money in 1929. And so what happens is, you know, a lot of times high school textbooks and whatnot say that's the cause of the depression. No, but it does create a ripple. And it's more of an effect, but it's an accelerant to the depression. In the red, look at what happens in October 1929. Whew, that is a lot. And you can see in 1930 it builds, and then drops off again. The economy is just not on a sound. What sparked it? We've already talked about these things: buying on the margin, the overspeculation, plus the weaknesses of the economy beforehand. So we've got that part figured out. Effects. Again, like I said, oh yeah, it's bad. It's bad. 5,700 banks failed. That's a lot. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money that's vanished. That's, you know, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all banks that are gone, and that money has evaporated. It just went away. That is not cool, as we'd say back in my day. You see people here waiting in line to get money out of the bank. What happens when that bank physically runs out of money? If you're at the back end of that line, you're in trouble. And so bank failure, so money, 20,000 businesses alone in 1929, 30,000 in 1932, same numbers I gave you the other day. And so what happens is when you have that many businesses fail, you're teetering on the brink of an abyss, an abyss the likes of which we had never seen. America had depressions. We had recessions. We had never seen anything like this. Employment, how officially it reached 25%, but I think I told you it's probably closer to 40. It may have been even higher than that, but that's neither here nor there. It is horrendous. That's what we need to know. In urban areas that are reliant on manufacturing, that number's higher. And can you imagine higher than 25% or imagine higher than 40%? We cannot fathom that today. And we know who the most susceptible are your unskilled, uneducated. And so this next slide is going to put it in a graph form, and that is a much. So you look at the unemployment rate, 25%. Let me be a little higher by August of 32. Watch what happens. You see the rate drive up from August to 29, boom, hits that peak, drops down in July of 37 where it looks like, okay, we're getting back to somewhere that's normal. Bam! Then we hit another stage of the depression. It goes back up to, roughly 20%. It's probably really closer to 25. And then by June of 42, there is virtually no such thing as unemployment in America with World War II. Another slap in the face. We get the wage cuts. If you keep your job, your total wages are going to drop. Some people's drop by 41%. I constantly tell my teachers here at Northview that we're so fortunate in this pandemic because we don't really have to face this kind of stuff. At least we hope not. Never, no telling. What the General Assembly is going to do. But when you start people aren't laid off, they're not out of a job, but when their wages drop by that much, they're not spending the money. And if you don't spend the money, the economy, which turns in a little circle, starts to slow down. And that's a bad thing, which causes more layoffs, more bank failures, more businesses to close. It's a vicious cycle that runs in reverse. Losing farms. 25% of farmers losing their land. Can you imagine? And that is due to those drops in commodity prices and then heavy mortgages, heavy indebtedness that they can't pay back, so banks begin to recall them. Again, if you read The Grapes of Wrath as your book to review, you're going to see this. There's a general psychology. And we talked about that in the last lecture too, about how it's traumatic and how families break up and how men abandon families, even females abandon their families. Hoovervilles and Hoover gravy, which was made with water instead of milk or cream. Hoover blankets were made out of newspaper, and they're not really a blanket. It's just put stuff in newspaper around you to keep warm. There's a psychology there that America is in the doldrums, and that's going to be as hard to overcome as anything. To the international economy. Look, there's Adolf Hitler. This is why he comes to power. Look at what he says. We're taking the fate of the nation in our hands. He has decided, you know what? I'm going to bring it back myself. And while we know what he does in the end, he does bring Germany back. Now, it's by hook and by crook and a couple other things. But that's how he comes to power. I'm going to make Germany strong again, make it great again. Where in America, you look at our GDP or GN, it should be gross national product, GNP. Yeah, I can't spell. It drops by 41%. And, if you're in America, we're the hardest hit. If you're in Germany, they think they're the hardest hit. If you're in other countries, they think they're the hardest hit. And then the international debt structure does collapse. And in doing so, that means countries that owe money and businesses that owe each other money. Oh, my goodness, it is a zoo in terms of getting that stuff back. So what happens? Today, we look to the President of the United States, whether it's, end of the night, it may not be Donald Trump anymore. Who knows? But you're going to look to that president and say, what you going to do? Whatever is going to create about this. But I want you to look at number one, and I put it there for a reason. He thought that the Depression was imported, and it was caused from the outside, not weaknesses in our own economy. It was from the outside. Somebody's done something to us. Look at number two. Says, much like a virus, and you notice down at the bottom, I had created this particular lecture in 2012 and never thinking that COVID-19 would be here. But don't, not to be political, it is what it is these days. But President Trump has consistently said that virus was imported from somewhere, from Wuhan, China, and they call it the China virus and everything else. Hoover did the same thing with the Depression. Now, we know that Hoover's not quite right, but there is an international element to it, but it wasn't just imported and it infected us like a virus. But he says it will run its course in due time, just like, because they're just coming off of the Spanish flu that happened in 1918, 1919, 1920, which did simply run its course. And look down there at the bottom, he said, there's nothing really wrong, just needed to get through the worst. Don't involve the government to a tremendous degree, but we know he did do that more than any other president up to that time. All right? No, we know already. Getting the co-ops set up, store those commodities in big silos and whatnot to shore up those prices, maximize farm income, because if not, the farmers are going to lose their farms to the banks. The problem was it didn't work because it was too little. It's trying to put a Band-Aid on an amputation in so many ways. But again, it's more than we've ever seen before. Smoot Tariff Act, chunking 60% import tax on things, trying to protect that native industry. While it was designed to help, yeah, it helped worsen the Depression in all reality because our trade deficits get so wide. Building national highways, building the Hoover Dam, asking business not to lay off their workers, asking them not to cut their Construction Finance Corporation here. Loan that money to big business and the banks, which has got a very bad look to it. It was probably the right thing, just not the right look, because it prevents a lot of companies from going out of business. And if they do, their workers are not getting paid. And so what you get here is Hoover with the biggest government involvement program up to that point in history. And people kind of looking at him with their mouth open, going, what are you doing? This idea of rugged individualism that we saw, and seeing direct relief would breed laziness and dependence. I mean, today, I don't think that's the prevailing mindset. I think sometimes, those kind of actions like that, those kind of thoughts like that are seen very anachronistic. They're outmoded. But in 1929, this is a big deal. And how you got to take care of yourself, take care of your family, and everything's going to be okay. Hoover is not easy, because the thing is, we like to blame people in America. And was it fault for the Depression? Probably not. But you're the president when it's hit, and so you're the president, you get the bad with the good. Was he right in his approach? I'm really not sure. But it wasn't smart when a lot of people are suffering to do some of the things he did. Okay, now in hindsight, may have been correct, but you don't do that and get to stay a politician very long. So did he do enough? In 1932, everybody said, no, you didn't. You didn't do it, Hoover, even though you did more than anybody up to that point. No, you did not. Herbert Hoover as a liberal, which is almost antithetical to the way most people want to portray him. But you look at the deficits that he ran. That didn't happen before. Hoover's borrowing money to spend it, just like we do today. Wanting to jumpstart that economy with a stimulus, just like we've seen a couple of times in our life. And in reality, he probably did keep it from being worse than it was. Worse than it was. That doesn't even make sense. Being worse than it could have been. Advocated more government involvement, and in so many ways paved the way for what we're going to call the. So in that election of 1932, you would think Herbert Hoover couldn't get elected dog catcher, and he does not get reelected. But what ends up happening is you got a pretty close, close isn't the right word, a closer popular vote than the electoral count would say. So by 1932, we know what's going to happen. You're going to get Franklin Roosevelt in for a New Deal. We're going to get him in out of the red with red. What are some of those effects? Again, people are still out of work. All those banks have failed. Businesses have failed. A quarter of the farmers have lost their farms. People losing their self-worth. And we know what wants to do. We know what FDR wants to do. But that promises of a balanced budget is a little bit interesting. But before the election, Hoover stood if not a good chance, he stood a fighting chance at being reelected until the Bonus Army fiasco. These people were veterans of World War I, and they had been promised a bonus at some point in the 1930s. Excuse me, it's not Corona, that's called swallowing wrong. And they decided that they want to march on Washington and want them now, so they camp out in D.C. with their little Hoovervilles and their little cardboard shacks and things like that. And Hoover gets tired of it, so he sends Doug MacArthur, who's what we would now call commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sends MacArthur and crew out there to run them off. And they end up tear gassing people and setting stuff on fire. And it's a horrible look for Hoover. That's what Hoover will do. And so, you have African American voters who switched to the Democratic Party and to this day have not switched back. And they abandoned the party of Lincoln because it was no longer really the party of Lincoln by that point. And you end up with an electoral landslide, but an interesting popular vote. We're going to all that red. That's Roosevelt. You don't think of Democrats as being red states, but sometimes you get that when you look for stuff online. With that popular vote, 57 to 40%, you would not think it would be that close, even though Hoover only wins 3 states. Pennsylvania, 4 states, rather 5. They're little bitty states. You see where the blue is. But you look at all that red that the Democrat Roosevelt won. That's an impressive electoral victory. Last time about the interregnum, which is the time between kings or the time between presidents in this case. And FDR would not work with Hoover. He would not. Hoover consistently reached out to him, and he would rebuff those efforts. And a lot of people have claimed that he wanted that depression to get as bad as it could, so he would look like the guy who fixed it. You hate to ascribe that kind of motive to anyone, but these guys are politicians. And at that time, there was a high-stakes game they're getting ready to play. And so by the first of 33, the economy has ground to a halt. And, there we go. And we already talked about moving the inaugural date. So you look at that New Deal. When you play a little cards, you know what a New Deal means. But here's where it comes from. His first inaugural. And you look at the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. Stricken by no plague of locusts. Plenty is at our doorstep. When you look at that, it's almost biblical. It's Moses-esque. Plague of locusts? This is what he's saying. He said, the only thing we have to worry about is getting so stuck in this that we can't get ourselves out mentally, which is a pretty neat way of looking at it. Here, you look at this thing, tax receipts plummeting, federal spending going up as opposed to GDP. Our GDP or GNP growth, look at it, it's negative. You don't stay president if that stuff's negative. But you look here about 33. Roosevelt's come in, and then all of a sudden that negative is only a negative 2.1 instead of a negative 13%. And then you go down by 34, plus 7, plus 8, plus 14, then a plus 5, and then there's that second wave, which is negative, but by 39, it's a plus 7, and you don't even want to see what it is by 42, 43, 44, 45. It is humongous. So it tells us that thing was bad. And then something happens, and it starts to get better. So is there a positive effect of the New Deal? Yeah. And we're going to. What happens is now we've got Roosevelt coming in the first 100 days. He's got to do something now, not later, now. Be apt to let him do whatever he wants it to, because he's got a massive Democrat majority. So anything he wants, he's going to get. Okay, and that pledge to help the common person or the forgotten man, absolutely. And so he's got to do something, anything. The problem is, our man Roosevelt does not have a cohesive plan. This New Deal is no more of a plan than there's a man in the moon. He said he likened himself to a football quarterback. Said he would call one play, and if that didn't work, he'd call another. I coached for about 12 years, and I don't remember letting over at Crest, I don't remember letting our people call any kind of plays. That came from the sideline. But I like the concept because he's pragmatic. He's not stuck in dogma. Listen, this don't work, we'll do something else. If that don't work, we will do something else. That is a good trait for a politician to have. Roosevelt was not stuck in such dogma. He was very wealthy, and some people called him a traitor to his class. No, he's helping that forgotten person. If this doesn't work, we'll do that. If that don't work, we'll do some more. And one of the first things, and he does that in a series of what he called fireside chats, because, people listening to the radio by the fire, and here comes Roosevelt selling you this is how it's going to be. And I liken this in my own boyhood, growing up during the Reagan administration. Reagan was like that, very grandfatherly. And you heard Reagan speak, and it's like, man, you believed him. Now, of course, now that I've gotten older and studied him more, there are probably a few issues there. But at the time, Reagan sounded like my pawpaw, and that made me happy because it's like, okay, if pawpaw tells you it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. If Roosevelt tells you it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. Today, if the president of the government tells us anything, we're like, okay, who's lying? So we're going to call on people. And that virtual blank check. And all of a sudden, the Congress is going to abdicate part of its legislative authority and give it to the president. Unprecedented. It won't happen again, in my opinion. But there's a very, very unprecedented level of cooperation between the executive branch and the legislative branch. The courts later are not going to be as generous, but they're not going to be able to get involved right now. So you've got a president and a Congress that are willing to work together with that virtual blank check. This is huge. New Deal, or something we call the 3R: recovery and reform. And this relief is for the forgotten man. The forgotten man and his family have problems, and we've got to help them out. They need money, they need this, they need services. So we got to do that. Then, once that's established, we've got to recover this economy to pre-crash levels. We've got to get it back to where it was. We go back to that one chart that I had there, the little graph, and we've got to get those lines back to where they were before this thing started. And then once that happens, we can't have another crash. And if you notice, we've had a couple of stock market crashes, but we've only had one significant recession. I had one in the 80s that was a little rough, and then we had the one a few years ago, but we've not had a depression, and that's almost miraculous. It depends on how we're going to look at this pandemic and what it does as to whether we have, but we haven't had one on the basis of economic problem. Listen to me, I can't even put a S on words. So the premise of all of this is try something that don't work, get rid of it, try something else, keep trying, keep changing until it gets better. This is what people want to see. FDR's trying. If you're trying, the American public will fall all over themselves to help you. But what are the goals going to be? You've got to prime the pump. Any of you that have ever dealt with an old carburetor, a car that had one, you got to prime that carburetor. You got to pour a little gas down it and hope it doesn't backfire and burn the hair off your face. Telling my age, I know. But this priming the pump, how are we going to prime that economy? We got to put people to work. Because if you put people to work, they make money. If they make money, they're going to spend money. If they spend money, we're going to need to manufacture things. We're going to need to have farm. Priming the pump is a big deal. That's like stimulus checks today are designed to prime the pump. Because if you get them, you're going to spend them. That's what we want. That keeps the economy going. So what's next? That government is now a vehicle to fix the economy and to get people back to work. It's no longer a vehicle to help big business. This is a massive switch from the 20s and from the pre-progressive era. Okay, we got to get people back to work. And the vehicle's going to be the government's going to do it. And that forgotten man, he and his family are going to be the focus of those programs, unlike Hoover. Now, we're going to see a lot of this in the banking crisis. When you got banks failing and people losing their money, you got a problem. So what happens is he's going to declare a banking holiday. In March of 33, just took office. All the banks shut down, and those that are solvent could reopen, which means they got enough money to keep going. First National Bank in Shelby, which is now the Bank of OzK, was one that only shut down till they could figure out it was solvent and came back. So it never really stopped. So this is a good thing. This restores people's faith. If you have your money in the bank, it's going to be okay. And then took America off the gold standard. Anybody who had private gold in the Treasury, anybody that has private gold reserves, they have to go to the Treasury. No currency in gold. And what happens is now we can have more cash than we have gold to back it up. So it's a little bit inflationary, causes the value of the dollar to go down, but it allows an expansion of the money supply that makes the economy run better. All right? And so now the EBA allows the Treasury to merge or liquidate insolvent banks. This keeps people from losing their shirts. And one of his fireside chats was actually called a mattress chat. He said, don't put your money in the mattress, put it in the banks where it's safe. And this has kind of a twofold intent. One of them is to make people have faith in the banking system. But the more money that's in the bank, the more money the bank can loan and keep the economy moving. So it's kind of a twofold thing. My own grandmother, who passed away in 2000, she never had all of her money in the bank. She was having some surgery, and she called my daddy in to see her in her bedroom, and she told him that she had some money, and he needed to know where it was. It was in a Tupperware container wrapped up in aluminum foil in the freezer. We're talking number of thousands of dollars in the freezer. I'm going, if I ever go to a life of crime, I'm going to start robbing freezers because that's where the money is for the old people. We don't do that these days. Matter of fact, I think I've got $2 in my wallet. I never carry cash anymore, which is a modern development. And then we have the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and it's designed to refinance mortgages and keeping those recalls and foreclosures down. Something we had very similar not that many years ago because of this very thing. And then the Glass-Steagall Banking Act created the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, which is why your money in the bank is relatively safe. So all of that's how he handles that banking crisis, which is so different than how Hoover handled anything. Now people are like going, this is okay. And so over changes, three big ones. The first is going to be government is now an active player, and I've called it paternalistic. They're an active player here. And, if something's bad, they need to come and help and fix and save us. I mean, is it good? It was good in the 30s. Is it good today? Listen, we're always reimagining what we think our government should do. And so the second one, laissez-faire is cruel and it's unworkable, and we got to get rid of it. So there's not going to be a pure laissez-faire. Not that there ever really was, but there's not going to be a pure laissez-faire model anymore. And last one is things were supposed to be temporary. These programs and this government involvement was never seen as permanent. But then once you start something, you can't get it gone. And so what you see here is what's considered appropriate then has changed in a dramatic way versus what we saw in the early 20s versus what we saw at the turn of the 20th century versus what we think today in 2020. So those fundamental changes come around during this time. And so it got a little short. And it's this New Deal reforms and the relief programs and all that conditioned America to think in national terms. There is nothing wrong with that. And when you talk about reform solutions, it's like today, everybody's like going, how's the government going to handle the corona crisis? Well, you've seen a little bit of laissez-faire with it in that, with the way the states working with the governors. But what we're going to see coming out of this New Deal is World War II, and how at World War II you have a total restructuring of the economy and our political system to fight this war. And so that's going to sustain our beliefs about the federal government, and it's something we're going to be dealing with from the 1930s until the end of this course, which is going to happen some roughly around year 2000. So anyway, all right, that's quick, it's dirty, but it is the conclusion of the New Deal and the Depression. And so we'll stop here, and we'll have a little midterm here at the end of the week, and we'll pick it up with the Second World War next week.